But the idea with smart contracts is to have reproducible code running on the Ethereum.
Yeah, okay. That
And so
would
you
be the
could probably use that.
So you're saying
I've heard
Yeah, so
whatever
Just like out of this.
It was like one
Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Plan for today is pretty straightforward. We've got discussion on 3 chapters out of Mythical Man-Month, which you should be continuing to read. And then we're going to finalize the voting on projects. Tickled to see we had a lot of projects up there, a lot of votes. I'm sure everyone voted, but if you didn't vote, you'll get a chance to today. With projects, I want to keep the number of students on a given project between 5 and 10. If you get more than 10, then you're going to hit points where no one has anything to do. You're all twiddling thumbs or whatever. 5 is sort of what it's going to take to cover all the bases, and that's a little iffy. So what I'll do is I'll put up a chart. I basically dropped all the projects that got through the 5 months. So I've got a chart with all the projects, all the current vote totals, and I'll do this lecture. We may take a, depending on how long it actually goes, we may take a little biology break after that, and then we'll come back and we'll vote on the projects. Give you a chance to vote on 2, and then we'll see which ones drop off, if any. Then we'll give you a chance to vote on 1 and pick what it is you want to be on. There's one project that currently has 21 votes. Seems quite popular, and I'm frankly quite amenable to having 2 parallel projects tackling the same thing. So if a lot of people really want to do that, we'll just split it in half, and we'll have this interesting thing where you've got 2 different teams trying to do the same thing. Yes?
It's actually interesting you say that. I saw another 2 projects, they're both the VR ones, which appear pretty similar to both VR games. I was wondering if we might combine them or
if they're lacking votes, you can combine them. If there's enough votes, enough interest to have them both go separately, and those who are voting feel they can go separately, that's fine. But yeah, we've had projects combined in the past where there's enough similarity, and neither one really had what the people involved felt was sufficient staffing for it. So a couple other things. I know a few of you missed marking off podcasts. I'll let it slide for now. First podcast, which is due Saturday night, I'll reset the due date to this Saturday, which will also be podcast 2. After that, if you watch it and you're late, you'll get half credit. Yes?
So for the podcasts this time around, was it just kind of pick whatever section
It's always
you
pick
want?
whatever.
Okay, because I know there are 3 different sections. So
There are.
once we-
Chuck had them set up by category, and he had pre and post midterm. For me, I don't care about pre and post midterm, and you can pick whatever section you're particularly interested in.
Okay, so it isn't exactly based on what we end up doing with our project?
No.
Okay.
No, just pick what you want and watch it. Yeah.
we will end up watching all of them eventually anyway, right?
No, you'll only watch 10.
Okay.
Yeah, there's only 10 assignments. So keep that in mind. And the other thing to keep in mind, which I mentioned, I think in one of my emails, early emails and so on, they have associated readings. I know there's one of them that the associated reading is like 47 pages long. So you might want, before you pick one, you might want to see if there's an associated reading and see how long the reading is, decide whether or not you really want to do that. Plus, there are some podcasts that are quite long. It's actually a set of like 3 or 4 videos.
The testing ones.
So yeah, the testing ones are one of those. And yes, that just counts as one podcast. So look at it, pick and choose. This is sort of like a big buffet for you. All I care about is that you do 10 podcasts and record them. If you're late, you'll get half credit. But it's good to do. Yeah, and I'm trying to think. I think 1 point each, so each is like 1%.
Do we submit those through Learning Suite?
Yeah. They're all assignments on Learning Suite. And you say, by midnight on Saturday, you say, yes, this is what I watched Friday Number 2 podcast. Yeah.
So you said there's, like, if we submit it late, we still get half credit?
Yeah.
Because, okay, how do I do that? Because I forgot to do it on.
Well, the one for Saturday, I said I'm going to extend the deadline to this Saturday.
Oh, okay.
So anyone who didn't get your podcast done by Saturday night, you'll have until next Saturday, but you still have to do number 2 by next Saturday. Yes.
So based on just something on the mechanics of Learning Suite, I
Yeah.
know you currently have them set up as quizzes.
Yeah.
So if you're going to go for the half credit if you turn it in late, you might have some issues because quizzes tend to close and then not be able to reopen.
Well, they'll close. What you'll have to do is you'll have to contact Ty, the
Sounds
TA.
good.
So contact, if you're late on it, if you're late on an assignment and you can no longer mark it off, which will be true for the podcast. I believe it's true for billable hours. Then just contact Ty and he can reopen it. He's got full access to Learning Suite. He can reopen it for you specifically and let you complete it. Yes.
So for the billable hours, for this one, it was just like yes or no, you did
Yep.
the project.
And that's actually true for the next 2. That was the next thing I was going to bring up. Because it's not going to require, if you've got 5 of you on a team, it's not going to require 35 billable hours to set up the wiki. Or to do the org chart for that matter. So for the next 2 billable hours things, the next one will be associated with your team setting up its wiki, and it's simply a yes/no. We did it. For the org chart, it's yes, no, we did it, but at that point, you should know, and at that point, your next assignment is doing the requirements. At that point, you know what you're doing, you know who's doing what, and you should divide up the work and start doing work along all lines, not just the requirements per se, but whatever exploration, assembly of tools, so on and so forth you're doing. The other thing with the billable hours to keep in mind is that there is, starting with the 4th one, it's expecting 7. It will let you put in as many as 9, and it also lets you put in a lesser number, which means that you actually have some slack. So if you work extra hard on a project in a given week and you put in 9 billable hours, log that, and you now have, in essence, a credit that will automatically apply on a subsequent billable hours where you do 5. So we'll talk more as we get it. Any other questions? Yes?
What counts as billable?
Basically, any time you're spending team meetings, class time per se as class. Lecturing doesn't count as billable. However, starting actually today and for the rest of the semester, I will typically end early, and you can meet as a team right now if you want. You can go off somewhere else. You can arrange somewhere time. So anytime you spend meeting and discussing things as a team with other team members, doing actual work for the project, doing research for the project. In other words, if you're trying to decide, there's 3 engines here, we want to find one to use. Or there's an engine and I have to come up to speed on it. Here's documentation, I'm writing code, I'm testing stuff out. Basically, any time that you spend on the project. Don't be like some lawyers. I work with lawyers a lot. There are famous stories of lawyers, thinking about a case while in the shower and counting that as billable time. If you're doing actual work on a project, do work on a project. But I'm not supervising you. I'm not going to come back and audit you. There's this class, trust me, I pretty much rely on the honor system. Any other questions? I'll talk more about stuff for next week at the end of this lecture. Yes?
So because right now our names are in a couple of projects, when do we just decide?
Well, actually, we'll decide today.
Okay.
I'll do this lecture, then after this lecture, all you were expressing before is sort of interest in what you're going to have. What we're going to do after this lecture is we're going to nail it down to the actual projects going forward and who's on what project. So this is a chance to sort of vote and decide what you want, and we may have to do a little shuffling. If we have 30 people on one project, it's like, okay, we have to break this up a little. Like I said, with the 21 on one project. Maybe like, okay, if all of you really want to do this, let's do 2 separate teams doing the same thing. We can actually have a very interesting comparison at the end of the semester to see how the 2 teams did, starting off with the same concept. Because heaven knows there are never any apps or applications that are just directly an implementation or directly based on the same idea as something else. Okay, Mythical Man-Month. Oops. There we go. Is that print too small for you and back? Okay. Let's see, I can change to a different style. I like this. Fred Brooks says, okay, Tower of Babel. They had a clear mission. They had plenty of manpower, staffing. They had materials. They had time. They had technology. What failed was communications and organization. Project failures almost always boil down to human factors. In another context, I said you could just as easily cite the 7 deadly sins. Pride, envy, greed, sloth, lust, anger, and gluttony. Thank you. PEG-LAGS is actually the acronym I have to use. Anyway, but it's actually what you'll find in a lot of software projects, a lot of IT projects, not just software, is that you do have a clear mission, you do have the staffing, you have materials, you have time, you have technology, and it always fails because people don't understand or agree as to what they're trying to do, or they will not properly communicate. And we're going to talk about the problems there. Now, for those of you, how many of you have done internships? And how many of you currently work doing IT type stuff? Okay. A lot of you have a lot of real world experience here. You ever seen these issues with communication and organization? Give me some examples of where you've seen this negatively impact what you're doing.
We had a project manager dealing with a client who liked to talk a lot, but she wouldn't summarize what the client really wanted, and so every single time she's talking to the client, she'd have to pull in a developer or a designer or something, and just completely rely on them to do the project manager's job, basically. And so it just wore down and just took way too many hours away from designers and developers.
Actually getting work done.
So like her communication as the project manager was basically no communication. She wasn't doing any of it. She was just
Okay. Other examples? Yeah.
Our marketing and development team did not communicate well, and it caused some serious drama. Like, super problematic.
Just give me, you don't have to go into specifics, but give me an example of sort of consequences of lack of communication.
It just got to the point where, like, some of the marketing guys felt like they were like enemies with the development guys.
Oh, yeah.
Anything that one of the teams suggested, the other team was not didn't like. And it always seemed like one of the teams was doing stuff behind the other one's back. So it just got really dysfunctional when they had meetings.
Yeah, and we will actually talk about that throughout the course. There is almost an inherent antagonism between the sales and marketing team and the engineering team because of promises made or things not delivered. Yes?
So there was a big gap between the project managers and the product owners, who are the clients who wanted this product done. And we worked on two of those products for about 7 months of the year. This is a team of 6 developers working full-time.
Oh, man.
And so a lot of wasted manpower, a lot of wasted resources, and a lot of frustration because at the end of 6 months, the product owner is like, oh, well, I thought this would take 3 months. Why does it take 6 months? Well, we told you it would take 6 months. So they canceled the project. So it's 6 months of wasted money, time, and everything else.
Yes.
I had a pretty literal difficulty in communication was working with a large number of offsite developers.
Uh-huh.
it was very, very difficult working past like a language barrier.
Yeah.
Actually. So like we'd explain something was done and it had to be broken down into extremely simple steps to the point where you might as well have done it yourself.
Yeah, that's a real issue with, it can be an issue. I have had to manage geographically diverse teams. And even when you have good communications and good understanding, it's a pain. If you add issues such as language barriers, cultural barriers, time zone differences, and so on, it can be very disruptive to a project, particularly if, as seems to be the nature of most software projects, you're under a tight deadline. Again, we're back to it's very easy to lose a day. It's almost impossible to make it up.
Yeah, I see this with my father. He's in software, and his company's flying him to India just so that he can be there to answer questions for a team there just because of the time zone difference.
Yep, time zone difference. And it's just, even with video conferencing, again, one of the projects I worked on, we had nice live video conferencing between East and West Coast, and it was still a problem. Yes?
So, where I work, there is good communication, but the problem is that it's bottlenecking at my project manager, because he has all these things that he needs to communicate, but he has 3 different teams that he's in charge of.
Yeah.
And so, because of that, we'll end up without stories written or something like that, and just trying to figure out as developers what we're supposed to do without vision.
Yep, that can be very hard. I worked in a situation, it was a relatively small team, but it was one where it was a startup I did with a friend, and he insisted on making all the decisions, but he was slow on making decisions. And so it's like, I need to know this, 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 and this, and days would go by. It's finally like, Wayne, I'm twiddling my thumbs. I can't get anything done until you tell me what this is. So yeah, that's actually a very good point, that even when there aren't communication barriers per se, you can have communication bottlenecks. And one of the things we'll talk about in org chart is the need for clear lines of communication and decision making. A few other ideas or experiences. Anyone else? Anyone? Anyone? Everyone's like, no, move to the next slide. Okay. Brooks, now remember, Brooks is writing from a project he did in the late 60s to early 70s. He talked about a project workbook. This is what we do with things like wikis, online repositories, websites, and so on. You want to log decisions. You want to have a central repository where people can get stuff. You want to have source code control so that people don't change stuff. I may have already mentioned I testified in a case last year, failed SAP project where this is a $7 million project. You had developers all over the world, and there was no source code control system. They were using email. What? to send code changes and updates around. Which explains why the project never stabilized. And then people were rolling on and off on a regular basis. So it's like so-and-so was supposed to be responsible for this modification or this configuration, and he left the project and no one can find the work he was supposed to have done. Communication challenges. The more people you have, the more possible, I mean, it's literally exponential on possible interfaces, possible sets of workers. And one of the things we will talk about through this class is Conway's Law, which Brooks talks about, which is that the architecture of a system under development reflects the communication structure of the team developing it. In other words, the personal interfaces and communications end up shaping the software and hardware architecture. Solution, division of labor, specialization of function. This is something I'll talk about repeatedly. I have been, well, one startup, Desktop Publishing Pages. For the first year and a half while we were trying to raise venture capital, I was the project manager and the chief architect. And each role hindered my performance in the other. And as soon as we closed on venture funding, we went out and hired an outstanding project manager, Jim Hammerly, came out of Xerox, and the day he showed up, I literally spent an hour moving all the personnel files and everything else over to his office, and pretty much dumped all management and project management, all personnel management issues on his lap, and focused strictly on being an architect. Problem is that the priorities conflict. I think we talked about this 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
So I won't go much more into that. Plus, chief architects can be, until they have been burned. Chief architects are overly optimistic. It's like, oh yeah, we can do this. This will all just work. Unless she or he has that sting of failure under their belt, they'll say, oh, well, yeah, you know, I can see the whole architecture. It's a simple matter of implementation. Sometimes simple matter of implementation turns out to be what's really nasty. Brooks famously said, plan to throw one away, meaning plan to throw your first system away. Now, he comes back in the edition you're reading is his 20th anniversary. He comes back and says, this is basically an early attempt at iterative development. In other words, he was looking at pretty much, here's a big project with a waterfall type delivery, and when you get it done, you realize all the things you should have done differently. And you're pretty much going to have to go back and redo it. So with an incremental / iterative type development, you tend to avoid this problem. But, as I point out here, the opposite danger is because we have such great prototyping tools. You build a prototype and the manager says, we're done, right? Looking back over 40 years of software development, one of my proudest accomplishments was that Pages I built, and as we brought in other developers, they started adding to it. We built a prototype specifically to use to show to venture capitalists, show at trade shows, try to land funding. And when we closed on venture capital, I threw the code base away. And we literally started from scratch again. I did not, it was such one big massive kludge to just, shoehorn in new features and breaking all sorts of programming rules, it was being developed under Next Step, the next operating system, so doing a lot of quick and dirty shortcuts in there and so on, and we just threw it away and we started over again from scratch. Yes?
Do you recommend always nuking the code base?
If it's a prototype or a pilot, I would recommend, you might, if there are clever solutions you have in there, you may want to check it somewhere so you can go back and say, how did we do that? But the problem is, if management knows it's there, they'll say, well, just add the features to the prototype.
How do you tactfully say no?
You delete the code base before they ask. Yes, which is pretty much what I did.
Okay.
I didn't tell them I was going to delete it. I just deleted it, and they, when the issue came up, they said, "Oh, we don't have that code base anymore." And they were unhappy with me for a few weeks, but that was about it. Yeah.
So with longer term, more stable projects, like I'm thinking specifically Adobe Photoshop, they have like a lot of legacy code,
Yeah.
legacy features. How often would you reset the entire?
Oh, I wouldn't reset it there because that's really a maintenance issue. And when we get into facts and fallacies, we'll talk seriously about how maintenance works and why maintenance is actually maintenance. For the life of a given software project, or product, most time and most money will be spent in maintenance. Most of maintenance is adding features. And so, for something like that, to start over, you may have reasons why you want to, but it better be because you have some sort of generational leap in technology, or tools or something, and you want to build it on a new foundation. I don't think I would take the Adobe Photoshop code base and throw it away because you'd blow up too many people. And this is actually, we will also talk about technology life cycles. There is an entrenchment of technology. how long has Microsoft been trying to get rid of the command prompt in Windows?
For quite a while.
Well, yeah, we're talking decades here, folks. And there's too much that depends on it. There's too much that depends. In fact, there was some comment made that, what was it, about a year ago? Something leaked out that said Microsoft was going to make it hard to get to, and there was an immediate uproar, and Microsoft immediately came out and said, no, we're not talking about doing that at all. Right, yeah. Anyway, so, what have been your observations, experiences with being forced to build upon systems that probably should have been buried and then restarted? Any of you have that? Yes.
Like,
I'm sorry, your name again is
Alyssa?
Alyssa.
Like,
I have trouble remembering my kids' names, okay? Don't feel bad if I learn some of your names and don't learn other names.
Likewise.
Yeah, well, yeah, I really don't care. But I will be calling roll out loud for a few times. Eventually, we'll just start passing roll around, having you mark it off. But I'd like to at least learn a few of your names. So listen, your experience.
So like 60,000 lines of code of C++, MFC C++ split across like 20 static classes, and that's it. There was one line that was like 12,000 lines long, or one file that was like one class that was 12,000 lines long, and all it was a static class with a whole bunch of,
Stuff that was
700 line functions.
I actually had some,
and global variables everywhere.
oh, cool. I had something similar, but it actually wasn't that bad. It was at Apple, but I know what you're talking about, yes.
So one of the projects I worked on, it started as a prototype and then they built on it, and then it changed hands of who was like in charge of it like 3 times before I got to work on it. So all the previous developers were gone, and it was just me trying to understand the mess that was left.
Yes.
We wanted to do like a pretty full redesign. We've been using kind of like a legacy system, Frankenstein with a new system, to work together. But we like just full on redid our API and redid our front end, like with the new design. It actually worked out pretty well.
One of my experiences of having to go through the same thing was I was hired as a contract programmer at Apple. This is fall of '88. And they had bought a multimedia package and were using it for self-running demos and for user tutorials on a Macintosh, specifically for the Mac SE. This is all before you guys were born. I'm just making me feel old. Anyway, and they hired me because there were features they wanted to add and there were bugs. And they basically just bought the source code. The company said, here, have it. And there was one key routine, and much like yours, it was a Pascal routine that was probably about 10 pages long and had 20 or 30 go-tos in it. And I spent several days initially trying to say, okay, where are the bugs and so on, and finally said, forget this, and went through and did an analysis, and I threw the whole thing out and rewrote it, basically rewrote it from scratch based on the specification I derived from the original one. The new one was about 3 pages long, had no go-tos in it, and it actually worked. It solved most of the bugs, and it made it easy to add features. So yeah, don't underestimate how bad the code you inherit. And a lot of working in IT, a lot of you have already discovered this based on your comments, but a lot of IT profession is dealing with someone else's code. And you have to come up to speed, and you often don't have the people who are behind it there. It's like, I've got to figure out, I've got to do digital archaeology to figure out what this stuff does and get to understand it enough to fix it. Plan the organization for change. Now this is an issue, and this is something to keep in mind. It's not as important for your entry-level positions, but when you start to look at companies where you may want to stay for a time, one of the biggest failings in the IT industry, and this has been true for 40 years, outside of certain key organizations, is that there's no senior track for technical work. a lot of organizations, particularly corporations and so on, you work up through about 3, maybe 4 levels technical, and then you have to become a manager. And it's a transition. I mean, it's a transition you sometimes have to make. But what you'll see, and what I've seen over 40 years, and frankly what I've done myself, is you hit a certain point, it's like, okay, I really don't want to become a full-time manager of people. I'll go be a consultant. And I can continue to do architecture or design or coding or project review at a higher rate of, I was getting this full-time salary, and I don't have to deal with all that icky management stuff. This is a key problem. Some organizations in the past have solved it by having, a generic title, member of technical staff. That was classic at Bell Labs and been true at a few other places. And it will basically encourage technical people all the way up the chain. If you can get in a situation like that, it's a good company, that's great. But just be aware that as you get 5, 8, 10 years into your career, you may find yourselves at companies where it's like, oh, you have to give up doing anything technical and become a pure manager. Maintenance, and we're here. I've got some maintenance here. Most maintenance work on existing things is adding new features more than fixing bugs. And unless it's done carefully and thoughtfully, which of course usually you're not given time to do, the overall quality and reliability of the system tends to go down. Yes, it's commonly called software entropy, software rot, and so on. And the system becomes harder and harder to add features to, because each new set of features made the system less transparent, less coherent, less reliable, constrains the things you can do to it. Anyone have experience with trying to add features or fix bugs in a legacy system? Yeah.
So for the last 3 years, I worked for the church. They're mostly public-facing sites. So earliest Org was one of my biggest projects. And yeah, maintenance work was, I think about after the first year over there, the next few years I was the maintenance guy. And like, even though I was supposed to work on new projects, there was always a fire coming in.
We need you to do this.
Yes, and this goes back to the communication problem as well, is because the project manager, when he's blocked up, what do the clients do? They call you directly.
Yeah.
And then that gets even worse, because now you're answering calls and explaining things to them in normal language, which is very easy to do. But yeah, the maintenance, like, I think we hardly added any new features, fixed any old bugs, but I bet the number of new features we've added, I've added at least 5 more bugs with that.
Yep.
So yeah, it wasn't just good practice.
And that actually, that's a phrase, I don't know if I mentioned 2 weeks ago, a phrase I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, is technical debt, which means you're basically adding features to a system without actually going back and re-rationalizing the underlying code and cleaning it up. And the more technical debt you incur within a given system, the less reliable it becomes, and the flakier it gets as you try to add new features. Other observations, experiences with this? Yes?
So this is slightly different. I had an experience where I tried to add a feature to an existing system, but because I didn't understand the way the system worked, a manager later told me to change it and like make it fit into the system better. So it's like the system was hard to understand, and I completely disrupted it in a way, feature, and I should have done it in a like more just a coherent way, I guess.
That's
do like problem documentation.
That's part of living. I mean, it's part of living, part of learning with the new systems. Yes, you can say, "Oh, I see how to do this," and someone who actually understands it better says, "Well, no, actually, if you did this, this, and this, it would work better and do this." Other experiences? Anyone? Bueller? Yes. Hatching catastrophe. Okay. The figures are all over the place, but roughly 50% of IT projects above a certain size either are significantly late and over budget, meaning usually double scheduled and or double budget, or they fail altogether. It's a bit depressing. And it's been true as long, for the 40 plus years I've been working in the industry. The reason, we'll talk more about this, has been actually, we'll come back to this repeatedly from a number of angles, but the problem is, I think we talked about, is lack of transparency. It's hard to take a system, and even if you go through and look at all the code, to say, yes, I can see exactly how much it's done and how much it isn't, as opposed to, say, a building under construction. See, a building under construction, if it's a hole in the ground, you know where it stands. If they already have all the sides up and everything else, they may be having problems inside with wiring, they may have leaks in roofs and so on, but you see, hey, there's an actual building there, they have actual walls, they have actual windows and so on. With software, and we'll talk about this next week with the 5 levels of ignorance appendix from our Armor. With software, sometimes you literally can't know how close you are to being done until you're finished. And this is why if you ever hear someone say, oh yeah, we're about 70% done, we're about 80% done, that's like someone standing up waving red flags. Because there's almost never any rational basis for that. It is almost always wishful thinking. I've got the 90-90 rule here, which is true. 90% of the project takes the first 90% of the schedule. The other 10% of the project takes the other 90% of the schedule. There are a number of reasons for that. First is you really don't know what you're doing until you get done, and the other is that you tend to defer the hard problems to the end. And the hard problems can take much, much longer to fix everything. Brooks, I thought I think I've already mentioned that every time I think I've come up with some new insight, I go back and find that Brooks has already mentioned it, and this was one of them. Is my work as an expert witness. I observed over and over again this 3 weeks before the deadline rule. That you get these major projects, and they'd have a deadline, and they'd hold to it, and then 3 weeks before we're supposed to ship, suddenly everyone would say, well, we're going to have to slip. It usually slips 6 months. I thought, this is great insight. And then I happened, for this class, to be rereading Brooks. I thought, oh my gosh, he had it here 20 years ago. Actually, he had it here 40 years ago, back in the 70s. One of the things you'll do in this class is that you will actually create both a PERT Gantt chart for your project, and hopefully you'll update it on a regular basis to have some bearing in reality. Because the usual rule of PERT Gantt charts is they get created and then no one really pays much attention to them. They don't get updated, they don't get tracked, they don't get questioned. Observations, how many of you have been on projects that have gone way over schedule, way over budget? Anyone? Any observations as which you saw as root causes for those?
Mostly what you were saying about estimating. We should say, oh, we're about 90% done, 80% done, and we were about 20% done, or 50% done, or something like that.
Oh yeah. Yes.
Ours was understaffing due to developers leaving.
Ah, the truck factor. How many people can be hit by a truck and your project can still complete? And yeah, turnover is a critical issue. Turnover is actually something that I look at a lot as a expert witness in failed projects. It's like, okay, were the developers qualified, and how many left, and what information did they take with them when they left? That no one else, that there's no transfer of information. Yes. Yes.
So I was going to say, just like reinventing the wheel, so to speak, developing things that there are tools out there that can use there.
That's, that still happens. And this tends to be a sin of architects. Instead of going out and buying an off-the-shelf library or engine or something, it's like, no, I've got this brilliant idea. This will be so great, and we can monetize it afterwards. And occasionally people succeed with that. In most cases, they fail. They would have been far better off buying whatever they consider the substandard solution off the shelf is and just getting that done. Yes, I think you.
So, the point where you say milestones must be concrete, specific, and measurable, those three are very critical. Because
Oh, yes.
if you just set up a milestone, okay, we're gonna get done in a month, and you don't have any stories, you don't have a Scrum philosophy going, or whatever else, whatever methodology you're using, you don't have accurate dates. And we've been in projects where we didn't, and we overshot those by months. But then we started writing stories and started doing stuff. And even though it takes a lot of time in the beginning to get those stories down, it does help you stay on schedule.
Yeah.
Because now you have a good velocity with which you're going.
Yes.
So back to getting libraries off the shelf, some of them have weird licensing rules.
Oh, yeah.
And so sometimes people still have to write it themselves or follow licensing rules that go against the principles of their company.
Yep. No, and that's a decision you have to make. I mean, that's just, that is a common trade-off. But the build versus buy decision, which we'll revisit as well. You buy to play the game with everyone else, and you build to provide a superior solution. To the extent that you can buy something off the shelf, license, whatever, that just lets you be on equal footing with others. And then what you want your creative information to do, your creative insights, is we're going to do this in such a different way that we will have an advantage. People will want to buy our app or product, whatever it is, over others. Any other failed project, late project experiences anyone want to share? Yeah.
Our clients' expectations were just totally unrealistic. So.
Oh yeah. Yes, that's a very good point. That's the old standard cartoon. You want it when with people laughing. Tom, I think it's just Tom DeMarco, has a book called "Why Does Software Cost So Much?" Which is what he hears from clients, and his answer is compared to what? Software is incredibly complex and difficult. And people seem to think, oh, we can hire a bunch of teenagers and knock it out in 3 weeks.
Good luck.
Yeah, good luck. You get what you pay for. Anyone else want to share anything before we move on? Yeah.
How do you tell unreasonable clients that their ideas are unreasonable? Aside from just like no.
It's large. Well, the best you can do besides just saying no is to try and break it down and try to detail everything that you see that will need to be done. But it leads to a maxim that we will revisit here that I heard at the software engineering conference about 20 plus years ago, where someone said, the sad conclusion I've reached to is the only way to change how things are done within an organization is to go in every day prepared to be fired. And the advantage of a consultant is you've already baked that in. You're going to stop using it at some point. So trust me, as a consultant, I have said some very blunt, not that I am rude or anything like that, but I've said some very honest things. To the extent with one project I reviewed, and I'll go into this detail later in the course, but I literally had the executive VP walk out of the room and found out later he was going around trying to find copies of my 40-page analysis of the project and get them all destroyed. Unfortunately for him, a copy of that got to the CEO and he was fired. As was the CIO. I was a consultant, I got paid. Okay, not being willing to pass bad news uphill. One of your readings is going to be the thermocline of truth. So in fact, that may even be in the first set of readings. Not knowing the news is bad. This gets back to some of the comments on metrics. There are two fundamentally difficult things with project metrics. The first is most project metrics just aren't worth anything. They are not objective, repeatable, and automated, which is what's necessary. The second is that, and this is Weinberg, that which gets measured gets fudged. And there's a great book by, I think it's Stephen Austin, I'll bring it in and show it to you, which is almost a philosophical / mathematical analysis of the distorting impact of trying to manage metrics. Because when you manage metrics, as I mean, Jerry here pretty much sums up in one line. Manage metrics, and what happens? The whole effort gets distorted towards meeting those metrics. You don't actually accomplish it. Yes?
So what's your thought on like automated code coverage and unit test success?
Well, that's
percentages?
and we'll actually talk about that's actually a QA issue, and that's good. Glass in Facts and Fallacy talks about how much code coverage you can actually get and the things that code coverage doesn't deal with. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about things like lines of code. It's like, oh yeah, we're producing 2,000 lines of code a week, and we're definitely making progress. Okay, well, there are all sorts of problems there right off the bat.
So you need more quality rather than
Yeah,
progress.
it's a quality. You have refactoring. I mean, if you're doing good encapsulation and refactoring, your code base will actually take growth on a regular basis. A lot of metrics that are used really end up being distorting and not informative. And most of all, they're not informative as to when is the project going to be done, which is what you care about. You may learn things. I mean, with code coverage is great. Trust me, I'm all for automated tools. You want them, you want frameworks and so on. It ups the quality of the system dramatically, but it doesn't tell you when the product's complete. It simply tells you what you've got is passing the test that you've set up. I think there's a hand over here.
Yeah. So can you give us, like, aside from like lines of code, can you give us more examples of the metrics that you talked about, and do you have any examples of metrics that do actually work?
My single favorite metric, and I do this when I go in to analyze projects, I'll talk to all the developers and say, when do you think this is going to be done? And they'll give me a date, and I said, are you willing to bet $1,000 on that? And if they say, sure, I have a lot of confidence in what they're saying. If they suddenly say, well, I don't know, it's like, okay. and that may sound facetious, but when I review projects, a lot of what I do is I interview people, and I mostly interview people in the trenches because, as per the thermocline of truth, it's the people in the trenches who really know how close they are to being done. Only good news flows uphill, and usually there's a level at which the news has now become so distorted it's no longer reliable. This is actually one of the factors behind the 3-week before delivery slip, because the bad news becomes more and more inescapable, and it moves its way up the management hierarchy, and it reaches the top of the management about 3 weeks before shipment. It's like, well, yeah, we're really not going to get into production here. When we talk, if you go and read these articles now, but we're going to talk about these, I talk about some metrics that I think actually could be useful in a project. But when we talk about Armor next week, there are some inherent discovery in software development that make projection of project completion difficult, if not at times impossible. Because you really don't know when you're done until you're done. And it's one of the reasons why, as you're going to hear from me over and over again, if your project's late, the single best solution you have is to throw away features. Because you've got something that works. It's like, okay, we're going to ship this. Yes, we wanted to do all these other features, but we don't know how long it's going to take, so we're going to ship with this, and then we're going to add the features later. And we as consumers find that frustrating. You know, how many times do you get a, okay, how many of you bought and played No Man's Sky? Okay.
Thanks for those guys.
Do you remember the video versus the actual game?
The one with Jurassic Park?
Huh?
The one with Jurassic Park?
It's one with the large sandworm and everything else, yeah. Anyway.
We've just repressed all of those memories.
And I actually had some sympathy for them, because I know what they did is they went and said, we're shipping. We can't keep slipping this stuff, we're shipping. And a lot of what was supposed to be in there has come in since then, though I still haven't seen any sandworms. But that's what often happens with delivery products, is that they drop a whole bunch of features, they defer them to a .x release. Yes?
Do you think that's what's led to a new acceptance of early access and like crowdfunding type beta releases?
It is. You're basically allowing the users to be your test base and or determine a truly minimal viable feature set, as opposed to what you think is a minimal viable feature set. Yeah.
Some of those early access developers I've also seen are very hesitant, if not outright refuse to give release dates for features.
Yep. And which is frustrating for us as consumers. As a developer, I have tremendous sympathy for that. Because it's kind of like, I don't know how long it's going to take me to put that feature. Yes?
So as you were asking about another metric, we used to use a lot called team velocity.
Uh-huh.
So they would have sprints and they would try and assign us a number of tasks and see what a team velocity is. So basically it was something like, can we clear 10 story points in a week or not? That was one of the most useless metric I've ever seen. Because as you said, it's not objective. It changes every time. Depending on the project, the velocity of different engineers will be different depending on their skill sets, depending on who's there. It's not repeatable and it's not evolving.
Not objective, yeah. Actually, get back one metric in Pages when we were, and I'll go through the full story of Pages at some point, but we were a full year late shipping, which is pretty much what got me entirely focused professionally on why projects succeed or fail. Because I was the chief architect. I was one of the ones who had to go in front of the investors every month and tell them what our new deadline was, or schedule was, and why they should believe it any more than the one that we just were unable to meet. But in the last 4 months before we shipped, Jim Hammerly, the VP of Engineering I mentioned, implemented a find versus fix ratio of defects. For each week, the number of defects found versus the number of defects fixed. And as long as that was less than 1, we were on a glide path to completion. We were fixing more defects than we were finding. What I have seen since then in reviewing projects is I see where the slope is like this, where they are finding far more defects than they are fixing for any given week. I think that's the end of this lecture. And I'm sorry to give you a bathroom break right in the middle of between classes. For our next class, oops, that should say 129. And that shouldn't say 923. That's what I get for copying and pasting slides. By next Saturday, watch another podcast. As teams, you're going to end up creating your team repository. I'm sure there's going to be one person that's probably going to take maybe 20 minutes. But y'all get Billable credit for that, yes?
Do we make a public or private repository for our group?
Well, you want it set up so that I can go in and see all your deliverables and so on.
So there's 2 ways we could do that. We could do it as a public repository, or we make it a private one and add you to it.
I'd just go ahead and make it. Unless you have something you really want to keep private, make it public. But if you want to keep private and add me to it, you'll need to add Ty to it as well, because he's the one who will actually be creating your deliverables. I need to see it because what we'll do as you produce your deliverables is you'll do by Saturday. The following Monday in class will actually bring up each of your deliverables, have you talk about them, and grade them. So unless you have a compelling reason to make it private, I do it public.
Okay. I just know a lot of classes don't like things public, so that's what I was asking.
I don't care. This is the Jerry Weinberg. Always feel free to read books by Jerry Weinberg. Seriously. Talks about becoming a technical leader. I can't remember. This is the sad thing about teaching this class for the 3rd time now, and I'm trying to think, did I say this already last week, 2 weeks ago, or did I say this last semester? He says the 3 big sources of ideas are error, theft, and copulation. He says we're trained from childhood to avoid all 3, which is why we have a hard time coming up with ideas. It's either mistakes, or we're borrowing from someone, as Steve Jobs said, great artists steal, or we're combining new ideas. in a different fashion. Best reuse is to reuse deliverables, and one of the things that I need to get on is I want to provide actual standard templates for all your deliverables that you guys can fill out and just use, so you're not like, well, what does he really want? And I will probably do this by going through the previous classes and deciding which templates I like the best and stripping out their data and saying, here, do this. So podcast, repository, you get your full, you create the wiki and then bang, you get to say, yes, we've got this. By starting the next class, the remaining 4 chapters, 16 through 19 of Mythical Man-Month, if you go online to the CS428 website, there's the online reading stuff. There's a set called Webster #1. Read those. These are all posts that I have on online blogs for the most part. Most of these posts will take you like 5 minutes to read. This is not a lot of reading. And also online is a PDF of the 5 Orders of Ignorance by Philip Armour. I had not read this before I taught this class the first time. This is something Chuck had found, Chuck Knudsen. And I consider it one of the most important pieces of software engineering literature I've ever read, because it gets to the heart of the core difficulty in estimating software, and why we're so bad at it. Let's take a 10-minute break, come back at 5 after, or you can just sit here, and then we will go through the process of voting on projects and dividing up exchanges.